The journey to finding peace and meaning in old age. As we enter old age, many people worry about loneliness, believing that happiness comes only with a large social circle and a busy schedule. However, I have discovered a different truth. Living alone does not mean being lonely. Instead, it is an opportunity to find peace, freedom, and deep joy from within. Society often prioritizes quantity over quality, making us feel pressured to maintain numerous relationships to validate our worth. But as time passes, I have come to realize that what truly matters is not how many people surround us, but who genuinely understands and stands by us. In my younger years, I chased social gatherings, parties, and fleeting connections. But as I grew older, I found that silence can bring greater happiness than any crowd. A peaceful morning with a cup of coffee, an afternoon walk in the park, or a quiet moment watching the sunset. These seemingly simple things hold a sense of wholeness and meaning that I once overlooked. Living alone is not a loss. It is a new journey, one where we learn to love ourselves, cherish meaningful relationships, and find joy in simply being present. Let's get started. One living alone doesn't mean being lonely. For a long time, I feared the idea of living alone in old age. I believed that without a large social circle or daily conversations, loneliness would consume me. I worried about long nights, silent days, and the feeling of being forgotten in a world that never stops moving. To me, loneliness felt like a deep, terrifying void, something to be avoided at all costs. So for years, I filled my schedule with social interactions, trying to keep myself surrounded by people to escape the silence. But as time passed and friends gradually drifted in different directions, I came to realize something important. Living alone does not mean being lonely. In fact, it can be a gift, an opportunity to find peace within myself. Accepting this truth wasn't easy at first. There were still moments of emptiness, times when I wondered if I was missing out on something. But slowly I began to embrace the quiet mornings with a hot cup of coffee, the leisurely afternoon walks in the park, and the serene sunsets that I had never truly appreciated before. I realized that happiness isn't measured by the number of relationships, but by the quality of the moments we live. Instead of fearing silence, I learned to embrace it. Instead of worrying about being alone, I started treasuring the meaningful connections I do have. Most importantly, I found peace in my own presence. Living alone is not a loss. It is a journey toward freedom and serenity within the soul. 2. The importance of deep and meaningful relationships. I once feared that without a large social circle, life would feel empty and lonely. I believed that old age would be dull without frequent gatherings, lively conversations, or celebrations. I worried that as relationships faded, I would become invisible to those around me. That fear made me anxious, as if my worth depended on how many connections I maintained. But time taught me otherwise. As fleeting relationships naturally faded, I realized that quality matters far more than quantity. I once knew many people, but when I needed real support, only a few remained: close friends, family, and those who truly valued me. These were the relationships worth nurturing. From the fear of disconnection, I found peace in meaningful bonds. One deep conversation with a true friend became more valuable than dozens of casual interactions. A moment of laughter with my grandchildren or a kind greeting from a neighbor brought more warmth than any grand event ever could. This change didn't happen overnight, but when I let go of superficial connections and focused on those who truly cared, I felt an unexpected relief. No longer burdened by the need to stay socially active for the sake of appearances, I now invest my time and energy in relationships that bring genuine joy. And in doing so, I have discovered a deeper sense of peace and fulfillment than I ever imagined. 3. The transformation. In my perspective on social connections, there was a time in my life when I feared that if I stopped attending social gatherings or maintaining contact with many people, I would slowly become disconnected and forgotten. I once believed that my presence at events was a way to affirm my value, that having a vast network of acquaintances meant I would always be remembered and appreciated. Because of this, I constantly worked to maintain an extensive social circle, even when some of those connections were merely superficial. But with age came a realization. I began to see that not all relationships add real value to life. Social conversations sometimes only serve to fill the silence, and lively gatherings do not always create a true sense of connection. I have sat among crowds, laughing and talking, yet felt profoundly empty inside. And that was when I understood. True connection is not about the number of people around me, but about the depth and sincerity of each relationship. From the fear of being forgotten, I gradually found peace in a new perspective on social connections. I no longer feel pressured to be everywhere, to stay in touch with everyone. Instead, I cherish the relationships that are genuine, the people who truly understand me and share meaningful moments with me. I realize that happiness does not come from the number of friends I have, but from the ability to be my authentic self in those relationships. And with that understanding, I now live more lightly, more freely, and more peacefully. 4. The value of silence and reflection. There were times when I feared silence. When I was younger, I believed that silence equated to emptiness, that without lively conversations or the constant noise of life, I would be consumed by loneliness. I filled every quiet moment with endless activities, social gatherings, parties, and relationships, simply to avoid feeling alone. But as time passed, I realized that not all noise brings joy, and not all silence means loneliness. In the later years of my life, as things slowed down, I began to face silence in a new way. At first it felt unsettling, even a little overwhelming. But then in the quiet of early mornings with a cup of coffee, in peaceful walks under the evening sky, I came to understand that silence is not something to fear. It is a gift. It allows me time to reflect, to revisit cherished memories, and to understand myself more deeply. From the fear of silence, I gradually found peace within it. I no longer felt the need to chase external noise to fill the spaces inside me. Instead, I learned to listen to myself, to embrace each quiet moment as an opportunity for self-connection. And in those still, peaceful moments, I discovered that happiness isn't found in constant activity, but in the completeness that comes from truly listening to and understanding oneself. I've changing the way I approach relationships. I once feared that if I let go of old relationships or reduced my social interactions, I would become lonely. The thought of losing connection with those I once held dear made me anxious. I worried that if I stopped actively participating in gatherings and maintaining a large social circle, I would be forgotten, left behind as life moved forward. That fear led me to hold on, even when conversations became shallow and meetups felt more like obligations than genuine moments of joy. But over time, I realized that not every relationship is meant to last forever. Some people enter our lives, bringing beautiful memories, but as time passes, our paths naturally diverge. I learned to accept that not everyone will walk this journey with me until the end, and that doesn't mean I am forgotten or that my worth has diminished. Instead of focusing on quantity, I shifted my perspective to quality. I stopped trying to maintain every relationship and instead began to cherish the ones that truly matter. From the fear of losing connections, I gradually found peace in building and nurturing meaningful relationships. I now spend time with those with whom I can truly be myself, people who listen, share, and care sincerely. I also learned to appreciate moments of solitude, no longer seeing them as loneliness, but as a source of tranquility. And through this shift, I understood that happiness does not come from being surrounded by many people, but from having the right connections, those that truly nourish the soul. 6. The freedom of letting go of societal expectations. There was a time when I feared that if I stopped attending social events or maintaining an active image, I would be seen as outdated, forgotten by those around me. My whole life I had been accustomed to meeting the expectations of others, showing up at gatherings, maintaining relationships even when they no longer brought me joy. I worried that if I declined invitations, avoided long trips, or stepped away from crowded events, I would become an isolated old person, no longer part of society. But as I grew older and gained clarity, I began to ask myself, why am I holding on to things that no longer serve me? Why must I live by society's expectations instead of embracing life in a way that feels right for me? I realized that happiness does not come from seeking validation, but from living authentically. I no longer feel pressured to take part in activities that do not bring me joy. Instead, I choose to invest my time in relationships and moments that truly matter. From the fear of being forgotten, I found peace in letting go of unnecessary expectations. I learned to appreciate the simple joys I once overlooked because I was too busy pleasing others. I feel lighter, no longer burdened by the need to prove anything to anyone. And in that realization, I discovered that true freedom comes from being honest with myself, releasing the pressure to meet others' expectations, and simply living life in my own meaningful way. 7. Adapting to changes in old age. I once feared that as old age arrived, changes in my health, energy, and social abilities would leave me feeling weak and isolated. I had always lived an active life, easily traveling, meeting friends, and engaging in social activities. But little by little, I began to notice that my body was not the same as before. Long trips became exhausting, large gatherings drained my energy, and even long conversations no longer held the same excitement. I worried that if I could no longer participate in the activities I once enjoyed, I would be forgotten, gradually fading into the background of other people's lives. The early days of recognizing these changes were not easy. I tried to hold on to old habits, pushing myself to keep up as if I were still young. But the more I resisted, the more exhausted I became. Then I realized that instead of fighting change, I needed to learn how to adapt. I stopped chasing a fast-paced life and began adjusting to what my body and soul truly needed. I learned to appreciate small but meaningful interactions, a phone call instead of a long trip to visit, a handwritten letter to stay in touch with loved ones, or simply enjoying the peace of my own space. From the fear of being left behind, I found peace in accepting reality. I came to understand that slowing down socially does not mean losing connection. It simply means finding new ways to stay engaged in a way that suits me. I learned to embrace simple joys, a slow morning, a heartfelt conversation with a loved one, or a quiet moment of reflection. I now understand that old age is not an ending, but a new chapter, one where I can slow down, focus on what truly matters, and enjoy life in a gentler, more meaningful way. 8. Facing loss and embracing the present. As I entered old age, a quiet fear crept into my heart, the fear of losing the people I love. When I was younger, I never thought much about parting ways. Friends, family, and loved ones always seemed to be there, an unshakable part of life. But as time passed, those I once held close began to drift away. Some moved to new places, others became consumed with their own lives, and some sadly left this world forever. Each time I lost someone dear, it felt as if a piece of my life had been taken away, leaving behind an emptiness that was hard to fill. I feared that one day the phone calls and conversations would grow fewer, and I would be left with only memories. In the early days of facing loss, I felt hollow and disconnected. There were moments when I sat in silence, reminiscing about those who had gone, regretting the words left unsaid, the moments I had taken for granted. But in the midst of my sorrow, my perspective began to shift. I realized that instead of dwelling solely on the pain of their absence, I could cherish the love that still remained. I learned to hold on to beautiful memories, not as regrets, but as reminders of the precious time I once had with them. From the fear of losing loved ones, I gradually found peace in embracing the present. I started spending more time with family, listening more deeply, sharing more openly. I learned to say words of love while I still had the chance, rather than waiting until it was too late. I came to understand that life is a continuous flow, and while loss is inevitable, there is always something to be grateful for. Now, I no longer let the fear of loss overshadow the beauty of the present. I treasure every call, every visit, every shared moment with the people I love, because I know that even when the time comes to say goodbye, love and memories will never fade. They will live on forever in my heart. 9 passing down life lessons and wisdom. There was a time when I feared that everything I had experienced, all the lessons I had gathered throughout my life, would eventually fade away with time. I often wondered, do my experiences, my mistakes, and my successes hold any real significance? Are the things I have learned valuable enough to share with the next generation? I worried that I was just a small part of life's endless stream, that the wisdom I wished to pass on would be forgotten. That thought saddened me, as if everything I had been through would simply vanish without leaving a trace. But then I realized that the value of life lessons isn't in whether they are remembered forever, but in how they can spark even the smallest change in someone's life. I understood that a single story, a piece of advice, or a heartfelt conversation could help someone navigate their own path in difficult times. I didn't need to leave behind a grand legacy. I just needed to live with sincerity and pass on what I had learned in the most natural and simple way. From the fear of being forgotten, I gradually found peace in sharing. I began telling my stories to my children and grandchildren, not as heavy-handed lessons, but as everyday reflections for them to draw their own meaning from. I started writing in a journal, recording my thoughts and the wisdom life had taught me. And in doing so, I realized that my experiences mattered, not just to me, but to anyone willing to listen. And from that realization, my fear disappeared. I now know that my life holds meaning, even in the simplest of ways. 10 Connection in old age. There was a time in my life when I feared that as old age arrived, my connection to the world around me would begin to fade. I worried that without frequent gatherings or long conversations, I would become a stranger to the life I had once been so immersed in. I feared that silence would replace laughter, that the relationships I once cherished would gradually slip away with time. This change unsettled me, making me feel as if I were slowly losing my place in the ever-turning cycle of life. But as the days passed, I began to realize that connection doesn't always require loud gatherings or constant conversations. I started to understand that true connection could come from the simplest of moments. A nod of acknowledgement from a neighbor, a warm smile during a walk in the park, or a heartfelt message from an old friend. I no longer needed to be present at every social event to feel a sense of belonging. Instead, I learned to appreciate the small but meaningful moments that truly matter. From the fear of losing connection, I gradually found peace in sincere, even fleeting interactions. I realized that genuine connection isn't measured by the amount of time spent together, but by the depth of presence in each moment. No longer burdened by the need to maintain every relationship, I now focus my energy on nurturing the ones that bring true joy. And with that, my fear disappeared. I now know that as long as I keep my heart open, the world will always be there, welcoming me in gentle and meaningful ways. 11. The value of self-love and acceptance. There was a time when I feared that if I no longer held the roles I once did, no longer the father everyone turned to, the friend always needed, or the colleague people relied on, I would slowly become insignificant. I used to define my worth by how others saw me. I was afraid that as life slowed down and fewer people depended on me, I would be forgotten. That thought unsettled me, as if without external validation, I would lose my sense of self. But then, I began to realize that my value was never determined by the approval of others. I don't need a title to justify my existence, and I don't need to be constantly surrounded by people to know that I matter. I learned to see myself not through the eyes of others, but through the lens of my own acceptance and love. I discovered that the most important companion I will ever have in life is myself. From the fear of being forgotten, I gradually found peace in embracing and loving who I am. I no longer chase the standards set by society or try to prove my worth through busyness or the need to please others. I now enjoy my moments of solitude without feeling lost. I have learned to treat myself with kindness, to cherish every experience that has shaped me, and to welcome life with a gentler heart. And in doing so, I have come to understand that there is nothing to fear, because when I love myself, I will always feel whole, whether I am alone or surrounded by others. 12. Using technology in a meaningful way. At first, I was afraid that the rapid advancement of technology would leave me feeling lost. When I was younger, communication meant face-to-face conversations, handwritten letters, and long chats over a cup of tea. But then, the world changed. Letters were replaced by short messages, and deep conversations were reduced to a few lines of text on social media. I felt like I couldn't keep up, like I didn't understand the new apps my grandchildren used. I feared that if I didn't adapt to technology, I would be left behind, slowly drifting apart from the people I love. But instead of letting that fear control me, I decided to approach technology in a way that worked for me. I didn't need to become an expert in smartphones or computers, but I could learn enough to maintain meaningful connections. I started sending messages, making video calls with my grandchildren, and joining online conversations with old friends. I realized that when used wisely, technology wasn't something that created distance. It was something that could bring me closer to the people who mattered most. From the fear of being left behind by technology, I found peace in using it with purpose. I no longer feel pressured to keep up with every new trend, but I know how to send a birthday message, how to see my grandchildren's faces even when they are far away. And in doing so, I discovered that no matter how much the world changes, love and connection can still be shared through new means, as long as we keep our hearts open to staying connected in our own way. 13. Old age is a time of self-rediscovery, not decline. There was a time when I feared that old age meant the end of meaningful days, new opportunities, and the feeling of being needed and having a purpose in life. When I was younger, I was always busy, always chasing something, always striving. But as I entered old age, as responsibilities slowly faded and long-held goals seemed to have been met, I began to feel an emptiness. I worried that the days ahead would be filled only with waiting waiting for my children and grandchildren to visit, waiting for changes beyond my control. I feared that my best days were behind me, and that the rest of my life would simply be a slow decline into obscurity. But then I realized that old age is not a period of decline, but rather a new chapter, a chapter of freedom, serenity, and the chance to explore myself in ways I never had time for before. I no longer feel the pressure to prove anything to anyone, nor do I chase after society's expectations. I can now live at my own pace, cherishing the small moments that are filled with meaning. I learn new skills. I read books I once never had the time to immerse myself in, and I take care of myself without guilt or hesitation. From the fear that life was losing its meaning, I found peace in appreciating each new day. I have come to understand that aging is not about loss, but about embracing life in a different way, a slower, deeper, and more fulfilling way. I no longer worry about not being as busy as I once was. Instead, I embrace the freedom to live in a way that truly brings me happiness. 14. Tell your story. I once feared that my stories and experiences no longer mattered. When I was younger, I often shared my thoughts, the lessons I had learned, and my life experiences with friends, colleagues, and those around me. But as time passed, I began to wonder, does anyone still want to listen? Do my experiences still hold meaning in this rapidly changing world? I worried that my thoughts would become nothing more than private memories, slowly fading away with time, unnoticed and unappreciated. But then I realized that every story has value, no matter how small or simple. The joys, the sorrows, the hard-earned lessons I have gathered throughout my life, all of them are part of the human experience and can serve as inspiration for someone else. When I finally opened up and began sharing my thoughts and emotions, I discovered that many people could relate. Many were walking a path similar to mine, facing the same doubts and reflections. And it was in these connections that my words found their true meaning. From the fear of being forgotten, I found peace in telling my story. I no longer worry about whether what I say is important enough. I simply share. And in doing so, I leave a mark, a message for those who, like me, are searching for understanding and connection on their own journey, the journey to finding peace and meaning in old age. Old age once brought me many fears: fear of loneliness, fear of losing connections, fear of being forgotten, and fear of the inevitable changes that come with time. I clung to old habits, maintained shallow social relationships, and forced myself to live up to societal expectations, only to realize that none of these things brought true happiness. As time passed, I came to understand that the meaning of life is not measured by the number of friends I have, the gatherings I attend, or the recognition I receive from others. Instead, it lies in the peace within my soul, in appreciating life's simple moments, and in nurturing genuine connections. I learned to let go of societal pressures, to focus on relationships that truly matter, and to embrace the solitude I once feared. I accepted the changes in my body and found new ways to stay connected with the world, using technology to keep in touch with loved ones, and savoring the freedom that comes with aging. I no longer fear loss. Instead, I cherish what remains. More importantly, I have come to realize that my story still holds meaning, that every experience, every moment, is a valuable part of my journey. Now I no longer seek validation from the outside world. I have found the most important thing of all: self-acceptance and self-love. And from that, I have discovered a deep, lasting peace and a life that is truly meaningful.